I'm going to read to you this morning from the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 8, verses 1 to 13, reading from the Contemporary English Version. In your letter, you asked me about food offered to idols. All of us know something about this subject, but knowledge makes us proud of ourselves, while love makes us helpful to others. In fact, people who think they know so much don't know anything at all, but God has no doubts about who loves him. Even though food is offered to idols, we know that none of the idols in this world are alive. After all, there is only one God. Many things in heaven and on earth are called gods and lords, but none of them really are gods or lords. We have only one God, and he is the Father. He created everything, and we live for him. Jesus Christ is our only Lord. Everything was made by him, and by him life was given to us. Not everyone knows these things. In fact, many people have grown up with the belief that idols have life in them. So when they eat meat offered to idols, they are bothered by a weak conscience. But food doesn't bring us any closer to God. We are no worse off if we don't eat, and we're no better off if we do. Don't cause problems for someone with a weak conscience just because you have the right to eat anything. You know all this, and so it doesn't bother you to eat in the temple of an idol. But suppose a person with a weak conscience sees you and decides to eat food that has been offered to idols. Then, what you know has destroyed someone Christ died for. When you sin by hurting a follower with a weak conscience, you sin against Christ. So if I hurt one of the Lord's followers by what I eat, I will never eat meat as long as I live. May these words from our ancient scriptures bless our hearts and our souls today. This chapter, this little bit of a letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthians, appears to be about food. Food that's been offered to idols. That's what the people of Corinth were wondering about. It was hugely important to them. A lot of meat that was available was coming from animals that were sacrificed in local temples. For the well-educated and sophisticated Christian of the time, this was not an issue. They knew the idols were not really gods. They knew that the meat was just meat, and maybe at a good price. And they were still likely to be part of the many aristocratic and upper-class social circles where they would be hard-pressed to avoid meat offered to idols if they wanted to keep attending the dinner parties of their many friends. Paul told them to think carefully about what they were deciding regarding that meat, because not everyone had the same sophisticated level of understanding as they did. Many new Christians were drawn to a new God, to the God of the Christians, without a background in Jewish theology that there was only one God anywhere, and that idols were fake. Jewish Christians would be horrified by the idea of eating meat sacrificed to idols, and less educated folks might be hurt and confused if they saw other believers eating whatever they wanted. Plus, the meat was often purchased right at the temple, so going there for meat could be the equivalent of sending an alcoholic to a bar to get a glass of water. Like they say about guns, guns don't kill people, people kill people, so guns are safe. Same with pubs. Pubs don't make people fall off the wagon, I mean. The people fall off the wagon all by themselves. It's not the pub's fault. The pubs are just fine. But it sure isn't safe for a newly sober person to go there. Similarly, a new Christian going to the temple to get meat might become again caught up in their old belief systems and practices. So be careful, Paul said. It's certainly permissible to eat that meat, but is it loving to eat that meat? Love is more important than knowledge, he said. Knowledge is wonderful. But how often do people with knowledge look down on those who are not so educated and not yet firm in their new way of thinking? How often do we feel smug and superior toward people who have a different understanding? How often do we laugh at memories of not being allowed to go to dances because that wasn't seen as Christian? Or how silly it was for good Christians to be able to play rook and not play regular playing cards. Do you know the game rook? It's a game that is almost exactly like regular cards, but the suits are colors, not spades or clubs, and there's no face cards in the deck. And there's a joker thrown in as well. Things have changed. What people said was totally wrong has often become commonplace, even in Christian families. Does that make these things right now? Paul wrote that one might be correct in their knowledge about why we do certain things or not, but it's not enough to know whether something is right or wrong. Even if you're correct, love is more important. Anyway, none of this is important to us at all, is it? No. Well, when was the last time that you went to the store worried about whether the meat that you were going to buy had been offered to idols or not? That question really doesn't apply to us. The huge concern that was so important to the people of Corinth, so important that it was a big part of Paul's letter that was devoted to this issue, really, for us, it's not important at all. Who cares about meat? Well, actually, a lot of people care about meat just for different reasons. A lot of people care about meat for the sake of the animals or the environment or the sustainability of the entire planet. We are free to eat whatever we want, said Paul, but we should think about what is the loving thing to do. Love takes precedence over freedom. The principle of love over freedom does not apply only to food. It applies to all the stained glass windows and art with white Jesus in them. It applies to pews and the strain it puts on congregations when some want to be done with pews and others can't imagine worshiping without them. These are cultural beliefs and practices, like how we do our funerals and whether we prefer burial or cremation. But for some, these practices are so linked to their belief systems that it's hard to separate them out from what is true or not. So Paul's words to the Corinthians are not so much about whether to eat meat offered to idols. Rather, it's about carefully weighing our decisions and freedoms. Is it loving? Does it benefit the whole community? The passage leaves us today with more questions than answers, but one of my commentaries says something that seems to be as good an answer as any. At the heart of it all is whether the church views Christ as one who teaches us to build fortresses to protect Christian community, or as one who himself is the bridge to neighbors of other faiths and traditions. This question about building fortresses versus building bridges is about individual freedom versus community health, both within our communities of faith and within the larger, even global community. Buddhist teacher Lama Rod Owens wrote that freedom is the agency to choose how we want to be in relationship with ourselves and the world around us. Jesus said that the only law was to love God and to love self and others. One of the great 20th century Theologians Paul Tillich talked about preliminary concerns and ultimate concerns. In Tillich's mind, love is an ultimate concern. That is, the only law, the only really important thing is love. There's lots else to be concerned about in life, but those are preliminary concerns, things that aren't as important as love. Tillich believed that idolatry was in play any time we put a preliminary concern into top place, where love is supposed to be, love for God and for self and others. I'm thinking about my mother right now. She followed a very strict practice of tithing, giving 10% back to God. But my mother came to see this through the eyes of love. And as time passed, I began to see her give at least some of her 10% to those in need in our family or in our community, without putting the money into the offering plate first. For Mom, love was the stronger principle than the expectation to give 10% on Sunday morning at church. Perhaps even the offering plate can be an idol, if love says otherwise. If idolatry is what people devote themselves to, other than to God and to love, ideas that are common in our society can be idols, particularly the idea of individual rights. For example, take Policy 713. Policy 713 was introduced in 2020 to provide minimum standards for the safety of LGBTQ students in our schools. It was meant to provide a welcoming and inclusive environment. That welcome included allowing students to use their preferred pronouns and names without informing their parents. Here in our small community, I don't know how parents would not find out anyway, but that's beside the point. The point was love, care, and support for vulnerable youth. The controversy comes into play with the idea of rights, that the rights of the parents are more important than the rights of the children, or even the safety of the children in some cases. Another example is the controversy over immigration in the United States. It's not really about protecting that country from illegal immigrants. It's about getting votes. It's not about caring for the well-being of any of the people on either side of the border. Paul says you can tell what is important by whether it reflects God's love or not. I want to draw your attention to how Paul focuses his response on Christ. He said that many things in heaven and earth are idolized, but really we have only one God. He wrote in verse 6 that God created everything and we live for him. Jesus Christ is our only Lord, he said. Everything was made by him, and by him life was given to us. It's like Paul was saying, what is our purpose anyway? Are we followers of Jesus just because it makes us free? No. Our purpose is to live for our Creator, to live for our life giver. It's not about rules or laws. Food and rules of any kind do not bring us closer to God. When it comes down to brass tacks, it doesn't matter whether you're vegetarian or not, for example. And Paul, for one, said he would rather give up meat than hurt a sensitive soul. I think when we step away from our core purpose to love, we inch closer and closer into the idea of individual freedom as more important, most important, instead of caring for each other. If we start to lose track of what is good for the community, we start to lose track of our reason for living. So many people wonder, what is it all about anyway? Why is life worth living? Can I make it worth living by acquiring more and more things, or making more and more money, or becoming more and more famous? No, I can't. It may feel good momentarily to have all those freedoms, but it is not a lasting happiness. There's a strange epitaph on my uncle's gravestone out back of Stanley on Graveyard Hill. His headstone on the back reads, "What for?" I would love to have a conversation with my uncle. How did he lose track of his purpose in life, his purpose for living? I'm pretty sure that he did not live a happy life. As I say, this passage births more questions than answers. Knowing if one behavior is more loving than another is not always clear. But ask the one who created you to give you willingness to look clearly at the questions through the eyes of love. May you be blessed in your endeavors. Amen.